last book in the Jewish Bible is not Obadiah, it's Job. Job. That's how they order it differently than in our Bibles. The last book of the Tanakh is Job. First book is Genesis, and everything else is ordered differently. All right? So just be aware of that if you're talking to Jewish people. All right? Job is the last book in the Tanakh. So the law, the prophets, and the writings. It was Pope Damasus I who approved the current, what we call canon of the Old and New Testament in 382 AD. So the current amount of books that we have in both the Old and New Testaments were approved as early as 382 AD by Pope Damasus I. Okay? Pope Damasus I was also the one who commissioned St. Jerome to translate the Bible out of Greek and Hebrew and into Latin, which is what we commonly call the Vulgate. Okay? Big move in the history of the Bible. Why? Because we find when we study St. Jerome that St. Jerome had access to certain scrolls, certain manuscripts that are no longer in existence today. So when scholars look at the Vulgate, they are looking at a translation from manuscripts that are no longer in existence. So it gives it a certain level of credulity and expertise. Why did Jerome translate certain things certain ways? He might have had access to manuscripts that are no longer in existence. It's a very fascinating study of biblical history. Okay? I'll get back to that when we get to the New Testament. This is just a little bit of Bible trivia here. These scraps of paper that you see are probably one of the oldest copy bits of the Gospel of Matthew. Conservative scholars estimate that these bits, which are called the Magdalene fragments, because they are housed in they're in England, in Magdalene College, St. Mary Magdalene College in England. They are about the size of large postage stamps. They're about like this. They're not very big. They're probably the oldest fragments we have of the Gospel of Matthew in existence. Conservative scholars estimate they were written between 50 and 70 AD.
How were they found?
How were they found? Oh, I don't know the whole archaeological background of it. I'm sure if you looked it up online, you could find out where they originated. But they are currently housed in Magdalene College in England.
Are they in Hebrew?
No, it's Greek. All of the New Testament was written in Greek. Okay? But they're probably the oldest fragments we have of the Gospel of Matthew.
When Moses wrote, now he grew up in Egypt, so he would not have known Hebrew as he was growing up. So where did he learn his Hebrew?
Probably from the rabbis and the scholars that were in the camps afterwards.
In the Egyptian camps?
No.
No, because that was
After they exodus down.
in the desert when
Yeah.
he found.
When he led them out.
When he,
Yeah. Because you remember that the Hebrew slaves still had their language, their culture with them while they were slaves in Egypt. So he probably picked it up from there. Okay. All right. The Bible is broken up into 6 covenants. This is your basic outline of the Bible. We talked about the theme of the Bible. Well, what is its outline? The outline of the Bible needs to be understood in terms of 6 covenants. What's a covenant? And a marriage. It's an agreement between 2 people. It's a marriage agreement. It's not a contract. A contract is for the exchange of goods and services. I'll give you a chicken if you paint my house. Okay, that's a contract. A marriage is I pledge myself to you forever. Much different arrangement. Okay? Saint Irenaeus was the first theologian to propose that one could see the plan of salvation in terms of covenant theology. He proposed 4 major covenants God made throughout history. One with Adam, one with Noah, Moses, and Jesus. Later in his theology, he expanded it to both Abraham and David. Okay? So the idea of the Bible or the plan of salvation being understood in terms of these 6 covenant agreements God has made throughout human history to relate himself to us first was proposed by the church theologian Saint Irenaeus, which is why he's my confirmation saint. I should be such a theologian as him one day. Saint Irenaeus, pray for us.
Saint Chip.
Yes. So, here are the 6 covenants. They come in the same form. There is a mediator, a form of the covenant, and a sign of the covenant. Like, what does that mean? Well, let's look at it. The first one is with Adam. The form it takes is marriage. And the sign of the covenant is the Sabbath. Okay? The rest that God instituted at the time of creation. Okay? So the mediator is Adam. The form of the first covenant is a marriage. One could say it's a couple. That's what creates the covenant. And the sign of it is the Sabbath. And Genesis 3:15 is where you find this covenant made between God and Adam. Okay. The second one is Noah. He is the mediator of the second covenant. His form is a household. Okay? It's a household. There was more than one person there. There was Noah, Mrs. Noah, his 3 sons, and their wives. Okay, so it was a family. The sign of this covenant is the rainbow. That's how you know the covenant's in existence and is in effect. And where do you find this covenant between God and man? Genesis 9:8-17. The third covenant is made with Abraham. This is a tribe. He had a lot of people following him. He had quite a group. It was a tribe of people. The sign of this covenant is circumcision. That's how you know the covenant is in effect. And this begins in Genesis 15 and is expanded upon in Genesis 17. So this is one of the reasons why we're going to spend a lot of time in Genesis. Half of the covenants God made with humankind are in this book. So we need to know where it started. Now, can you already see how the effects or the scope of these relationship agreements God is making is going like this?
Wider.
It's wider. First we have just a couple, a marriage. Then we have a house, a family. Then we have a tribe. So then we expand this and we get to Moses. Now we have an entire nation, 1.5 million people God is relating to in this covenant relationship. So it's the nation that God pulls out of Egypt to separate it from the other nations of the world, to be a light to the rest of the world. That's why God separated them. Where do we find this covenant? Exodus 19 and chapters 20 through 24. That really establishes the covenant of the Jews that God made. So we have a couple, a family, a tribe, and now a nation. Does it get bigger?
Yes.
Yes, David comes along and now it's a whole kingdom. 2 Samuel 7 establishes that this kingdom will last forever. God promises David, someone will sit on your throne forever.
His kingdom will have no end.
His kingdom will never end. That was the covenant promise God made to David. Is he keeping his promise?
No.
Yes. Who sits on the throne of David now?
Jesus.
Jesus. That's how it gets fulfilled. One could argue that though Jesus is the invisible king of the Davidic power, the Pope is the visible head that's maintaining this. Even though he's not a Jew, that has nothing to do with it at this point. He's handpicked by Jesus to be his ambassador. Prime minister would be a better argument for him, to maintain his kingdom here on earth until he comes back again. Jesus, remember Jesus gave that parable? A certain man had a vineyard and he gave it in charge of stewards and then he went away. Okay? So the person in charge is taking the place of the master while he is away until he comes back. And then what's he going to do? What have you been doing with my vineyard?
You take an account.
You give an account, right? So the Pope acts as the steward of Jesus' kingdom here on earth while he's away. And where did this idea come from? David. David was the king. But when David was away at war, he established what's called the prime ministership. And the way that David handed on his authority is that he gave him the keys to the kingdom. Oh, that sounds familiar. I've heard that before. Oh, Peter. What did Jesus say? You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I will give to you the
Peace.
to the kingdom. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. And whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. That was Davidic language. That was the same language that David gave to his prime minister. So that when David was away, the prime minister acted in his stead. Do you understand? So when the apostles heard this, they totally understood what Jesus was doing. He's saying, Peter, you're my prime minister. You're going to act in my place while I'm away. Oh, see, if we don't understand this background, this is why Protestants have such a hard time with Peter being the chief of the apostles, being the Pope and all of that. It's because they don't understand, ironically, they don't understand the history of David. This idea of a prime ministership in which the prime minister has all the authority of the king while the king is away is established under David's rule. So when Jesus says this to Peter, these Jewish men knew exactly what he was referring to. That's why when we read the meditation that we did, which was last Sunday's gospel, and it says, Peter said, I'm going fishing. What did the apostles say? I'll go with you. Do you ever wonder why that is? It's because they recognize that Jesus gave him the power to act while he's away. So if Peter says, I'm doing this, well, I'm following him like I would Jesus. You get it? So if Peter says, I'm going to quack like a duck, the apostles say, we'll quack with you. Remember what I said earlier today? The infallibility of the Pope is his unique charism. But the bishops of the world, in union with him, share in that infallibility as long as they're in union with him. Because where Peter goes, they follow. Get it? Because Peter is the prime minister of the kingdom of God here on earth while the master is away. And who's the master? Jesus. Now, Jesus isn't stupid. He knows these fallible men need all the help they can get. He's not going to just leave the Pope to his own ability. He says, I promise to be with you. So that means that the Pope cannot teach authoritatively anything that Jesus doesn't want him to teach. That's the gift of infallibility that he's imbued him with. All right? Are you with me? Yes. So this is why you need to understand this background, because it helps explain the kingdom of God that you're in now. Otherwise, it doesn't make as much sense. But when you see it like this, it's like, oh, this is the fulfillment of David's covenant. Jesus is reigning in heaven, to be sure, but he left an earthly representative in his place to guard, to shepherd the fields while he's away. And Jesus told us that he was going to do this in his parables. I saw you had your hand up.